Welcome to a Live in Freestyle video update. This one needed a little bit of an intro. This is a presentation that I gave to a community of tech artists. And people who work in film and game and so on will largely understand what I'm talking about here and what is being built. But for those of you who don't work in film or game, one of the questions I got as feedback when I was deciding whether or not I would share this out as part of Live in Freestyle was, what is a pipeline in the first place? So, real quick explanation of what a pipeline is for those that don't work in the business. It's basically the assembly line, the factory, the process, which images go through. So much like when you're making a shoe, you start with the design, then you get the sole, the glue, the sewing, the fabric, everything, how it all comes together, the processes, the bits, and at the end of the line comes out a brand new shoe. Same thing with VFX films and video games. How do you think all of those characters and imagery comes on screen? That's exactly it. A whole series of people are working together to assemble all of the pieces, and out the other end comes, hopefully a beautiful image that we get to watch and share and enjoy and experience. Now, when I talk about building a pipeline, an indie pipeline, that's the process that I'm talking about. So this may be fun. Definitely, if you're in the industry, this will probably make sense. If you're a rascal, this is, like I said, this is a lot of what I've been up to kind of on the side as I've been going through my career. It covers a lot of different things. There's some really cool projects mentioned in here that I would highly recommend you go checking out that I had the fortunate opportunity to be a part of. The other bit that feedback that came back was, what happened to all of this stuff now? What's the state of it all? Well, I will share that with you at the end. So without further delay, here is the presentation that I gave on an indie pipeline. Sweet. So what are we doing? What we're going to be talking about today is basically how I kind of accidentally built an indie virtual studio. Kind of going to talk a little about some of the history and the learnings. Before we get started though, let's talk a little bit about what we're covering. First, how it all started. There's a little bit of history. I'll try not to bore you with too much. Hint, I did not write a book. We're going to talk a little bit about the tool delivery mechanisms and a general pipeline overview. And then have a Q&A if you guys have any questions and stuff like that. There'll be some art and videos from some of the select projects to help combat your boredom along the way. When I run through this, normally it's about 40 minutes. So why am I showing you all this? So hopefully there's some cool stuff in here or perspective, but mostly you all are probably the only ones on the planet who might actually appreciate and understand what I'm talking about. Thank you so much for listening and your patience. And I think some of this stuff may seem fairly rudimentary and old stuff because it started quite a while before COVID was even a thing and virtual pipelines were more of a necessity for life, etc. So let's roll. So like I said, this started out as a book, but I'm horrible at naming books, so it was basically everything I wish I knew before I broke in. There weren't any online schools when this started. This was back in the mid-90s. It was pretty difficult to find stuff to learn, and I wanted to give people the info I wish I'd had before I broke in. All my colleagues were writing books. But then I quickly realized that a book was a bad medium because the tech was changing so fast. So I switched to an online training site, and that's where the site kind of was born. So I started recording hours and hours of each videos, like just teaching everything about rigging, body rigging, facial rigging, all the stuff, entire studio. You can see some pictures in here. I had just even explaining how a studio works, lighting, compositing, everything. And this all was kind of a first step towards the cloud-based delivery mechanism, because along with the videos, I needed to be able to walk people through the steps of all the tutorials. So if we blast way back to Maya 6, old school Maya had a web browser implementation in it. And using the browser, I could actually execute code from the text portion of the tutorials. So when it was step 1, create a box, they could click a button and it would create a box. So I didn't have to be with every student every step of the way. You could actually click and it would happen in Maya, and it basically was like I was right there walking them through it. But then Autodesk happened.
and they killed the browser. And so I either had to write my own web browser for Maya or find another way to kind of effectively achieve this. And so I talked to Autodesk about it because that was back when they still talked to their developers. And they basically told me it wasn't possible. So I did it anyways. And this is where kind of like the ARIGS delivery mechanism came from. Again, with awesome names, I called it Chaos Source, which makes no sense whatsoever, but that's okay. So quick break from the tech and where we're going. This was one of the earlier projects that we worked on for the pipeline, with the pipeline. It was a Happy Feet 2 iOS app. It was a very small distributed crew. We had a couple animators, a rigger, obviously, modeler. There weren't a ton of challenges with this other than, iPad couldn't handle first, so we had to farm the whole, we had to render farm all of the sprites, all the possible combinations, and build up combos. I think 90+% of the challenges with this project was all client-based, largely because they had no idea what went into doing anything in 3D. To put it in perspective, they were going to paint the fur on the mesh and thought Warner Brothers would be okay with it. So anyways, we pumped out, I think we were contracted to do like a 20-second bit, and it ended up being like over 1.5 minutes of animations. You could tickle this guy's tummy, you could catch fish, play drums, all that kind of stuff. So back to it, we're talking about the delivery mechanism. So as you would expect, there are two main parts. There was a server side. On the server side, we had the Code Depot database that kind of drove it all. Then there's the whole World Wide Web to connect us. And on the client side, there was a whole bunch of low-level network code that I wrote as a plugin to send and receive packets from the server to basically a listener inside Maya. And ironically, it was basically a stripped-down web server but I was actually handling all the low-level networking, packet sizes, when packets ended and stuff like that. It was way more work than I kind of wanted it to be, but it was working, so I was stoked. So delivery mechanisms, let's talk a little bit about the server side a little bit. Like I mentioned, there's a Code Depot. It had a SQL Server backend with an ASP front end and a cloud storage for the source files. I wrote my own version control, which is kind of wild. There's a lot of reasons for this, but I also wrote a web-based code editing IDE. A huge part of this was I needed to be able to deliver updates, versioning of code for tools, anything that needed to be delivered, and I needed to be able to do it effectively from kind of anywhere in the world, even my phone. And I think a lot of this will become clear as you kind of start to see what this all got used for. Some of the challenges when you're writing an IDE based on web is because of HTML and brackets, just even a less than or a greater than sign in your Mel or Python code causes all kinds of havoc with the IDE. And it was very rudimentary version control. Each file had its own version. You could version it up and you could publish it out, and the published version would then become the actual file that was then distributed out through the delivery mechanism to all of the users. File names on the server, they were all GUIDs. It didn't matter because it was on the server, but if you ever had to help somebody on the client side, shoot me, because you had no idea which file you were looking at. They were all just a whole bunch of numbers. On the client side, basically like I mentioned, that was a Maya plugin. There were a few major parts to the Maya plugin. Let's kind of break those down. There was the licensing, the source code manager, and then we also had the encryption. Licensing, look, my general kind of thinking with this was just keep it simple. I mean, back then, people could pirate, even now, like people pirate large-scale softwares all the time. And if you could pirate Maya, there was no way I was going to stop true hackers from doing my stuff. So why try? So the main goal was just to prevent accidental sharing or easy sharing. And it basically just used various aspects of the computer hardware, the system clock, the server clock, server license info to kind of create a license key that made sure people weren't passing stuff back and forth. Again, at a very basic level. But again, it was pretty successful. So now we're talking about the source code manager part of the client side. It was basically a Maya plugin, and if we're going to kind of walk through the progression of what happens, a Maya plugin basically executed a command, and then if the client was offline or online, it would basically run through a series of decisions. If I was online, I would check for and update the license file, ask the server for the file I was looking for, receive the file successfully, encrypt a local copy of the file to be stored for offline use. This was really important for users who weren't always online, especially in countries in Africa and stuff like that. The offline workflow is very similar, except it checked for the offline license file, which had been created the first time you went online. It would get a copy of the local source file that it needed if it existed. It would decrypt it, and then in both cases, once we had the code, we would basically source the source code directly into Maya memory, and then run whatever script commands you wanted. And that was kind of the source code workflow for the delivery mechanism. So encryption, super fast. This basically allowed the source code to be stored locally without giving people access to the source code. This was kind of pre the whole, code sharing, open source software movement and everything like that. A lot of companies were very concerned, and developers were very concerned about protecting their code. So that was part of what helped drive some of this whole encryption and everything like that. But it also created an environment where devs were super happy to share their code with me, and then also profit share. So we actually set up a whole tool library where anybody who contributed, the system would track how often people were using your tools, etc. And then if there were any profits at the end of the day, those got split among the devs. The file encryption was done using Blowfish, and I'll be honest, I don't know jack about cryptography, so here's a blurb on what it is. You can read about it, but I was able to kind of black box and get it working. The one piece that I didn't have encryption for, that I kind of had to come up with my own kind of way of doing it, was decoding and encoding the actual HTML headers. The reason for this was when you send a user's password and ID across the wire, Maya has no way to hide this stuff. And it was possible, if you knew what you're doing, to snoop and at least get that information. So I had to protect it. And so I'd have to go back. I'm not even sure if I could tell you how that worked. I'd have to go back and look at the code to figure out what I did, because it was quite some time ago. Still rolling. So another quick break. Another project we worked on was La Noria. If you all have not seen this, it's actually a really cool short film that Carlos Baena made. We actually helped out with all of these monsters, these guys over here on the right. For some reason, every time we work on projects, we always ended up with characters that had double spines and 4 arms, and you just definitely fun challenge even from just a rigging perspective. But again, just some of the art for some of the projects we worked on. This is a beautiful short film. It is done with top quality production standards and stuff like that. I would encourage you to go look at it, not because we helped with the monsters, but just because it's really well done. It's a pretty cool film. Okay, so back to the history and how we're stumbling towards our own virtual studio here. So all of a sudden I had everything I needed to deliver these managed and upgradable tools to anyone who had Maya and an internet connection. So one day I'm at SIGGRAPH, and I bumped into Bobby Beck, and we started talking. And Bobby, if you are not aware, Bobby, Sean, and Carlos all started Animation Mentor. So they were getting ready to start this animation school online, and I had a way of delivering tools and stuff to people who needed them, and it was a very complimentary relationship. And so it turns out that an online animation school is a bunch of people with Maya and an internet connection. So this kicked off a pretty intense relationship. We basically provided all the tools, rigs, and Maya tech support for Animation Mentor students for a little over 10 years. I say we, but a lot of times it was just me. There were usually over 1,000 active students per term, plus all the graduated students and alumni. So literally I was supporting thousands and thousands of animators all across the world, oftentimes as a single dev. The fun part about this was because the school basically spanned a period of almost 2 years. You're often supporting 3 or more Maya versions, running on Mac Windows, plus all the installation software and the source code dev for the 3 platforms, because there was a Linux development in some rare cases. And all of you know what it's like supporting one. Non-uniform hardware, everybody had their own special kind of toaster, which made it a challenge. And there weren't always the most computer savvy end users, so it was important that I streamline all of this as much as possible in order to deliver a good support experience to the end users. The cool thing was, so basically I found myself supporting this crew all over the world, and I realized one day that the way the mechanisms and everything worked in the delivery system, I could actually chart out all of our users. And so this was I just ran a quick thing through Google Maps at one point for fun, and each of these pins represents one of the animators I was supporting at the time. The different colors actually even denoted which level, in whether or not they were level 1 through 4 students and or alumni, etc. And as you can see, in addition to just the sheer number of them, I didn't sleep much because they're in every time zone pretty much. So that was fine. And like I said, oftentimes it was mostly just me. So it was cool though, because basically the system was able to deliver the tools, fixes and instant patches, and literally support thousands of people all around the world. And sometimes from my phone. I mean, I remember I was in Africa on a trip at one point, and I would just stop in an internet cafe, check on things, and it was pretty cool in the sense that it was working from that standpoint. So we had training, we got tools. Now we need some characters, and this is just, again, in the progression of how we accidentally built this. And I keep saying we, but you guys get the general idea. So that's when I started working on the animates. And what this was I wanted to build a library of characters to make available for people to use all around the world. Largely because I actually really wanted to be a character animator, and I did not have access to good stuff. So the big problem was, how do you distribute characters and maintain ownership of the characters to people all over the world so they're not just taking your rigs and using them? So I came up with some tech that created kind of like a copyright protection for rigs, that basically, using the code delivery mechanism and licensing, it would effectively, if you didn't have a valid license, it would basically render the rig useless. And this is a picture of what the rig looks like before and what the rig looks like after. In this particular case, there were some additional third-party people like Animation Mentor who were excited by this, because again, a lot of this was pre the whole movement for free open source everything. And at the time, a lot of people were stealing Animation Mentor's rigs and then just starting their own classes with them or claiming false things and stuff like that. So we also maintained and supported all of the rig copyright protection for Animation Mentor as well. And so basically this was an online library of characters for student use. We had over 40 characters by the time I was finished. Monthly releases of characters and updates. Probably spent about 4 years, about 4 years releasing a character every month. And then after I had covered the initial costs of building the characters, the Animates library was free. So anybody could use it for non-commercial use. And these are just some of the characters that we built. And the fun part about this was I got to have, because I'm a huge fan, I'm just a huge art fan. So I would do things like, I would go out and find like just a cool concept artist. Like for example, the top right, this dude's name is Tanner. And I went and hired Sean Galloway, and he and I did a bunch of characters together. And so I was able to just geek out about the fact that I was working with Sean Galloway on creating these characters. So I would hire them, they would design a bunch of characters for me, and then I would model them up, rig them up, and then distribute them online. So what's happening with all this? Here, let me pause this for a sec. Actually, I'll just leave that running. I received a lot of feedback from tech artists along the lines of, as this was all going on, like they'd never seen anything like this, and I should definitely patent this tech. And so I did. Basically I went out, found some good patent attorneys, and after submission and for approximately 3 years after that, all the tech basically had a patent pending status. It cost me over 20 grand to do it. It was nuts. It was nuts. And ultimately, it ended up not passing. Because apparently, in the whole patent world, if there is something that has been done or is generally widely accepted as already existing, then you can't patent that. And so in this particular case, a web browser that downloads JavaScript is close enough to the same thing in the sense that there's a server delivering code straight into the memory of the DCC app. And so ultimately the patent didn't end up passing, and I really want my money back, pretty much. So moving on, we've got training, we've got tools, we've got characters. Now all we need is a story and a way to produce it. So that's where my short film comes in. Basically, I wanted to be able to produce any film I wanted without limitations. I never wanted to, so many times I would see people make a short film or they go to do a project, oh, it's too many characters, I can't do this, or it's too complicated, I can't do this. So I was like, no, not gonna do that. I'm gonna build a way for me to make this possible. And by this point, I was like, there's gotta be a way this is possible. I'm supporting 4,000 plus people all around the world, if not more, making smart decisions. There's gotta be a way to do this. So here we go. 3 main parts for this, and this is where we're starting to get actually into the meat of the actual virtual studio. We have an asset or shot tree, depending on what your background, but basically that's just your directory structure. We got some production tracking and a render farm. So let's kind of break this down. The general primary objective was to make it as artist friendly as possible, keep artists in the DCC app, and not to have to worry about things like check-ins or publishing, and still make sure we got access to the source art. Even in professional studios, sometimes we lose source art. We don't want to do that. When you're working when you're running a company, if you are working with a client and then one of your remote artists disappears on you and you lose all that work, that's not going to fly. So my short film is still not done, but that's the tech art curse, I guess. I was too busy building all this stuff. Quick detour before I go into the studio. One of the favorite projects that I worked on was did the red carpet VR experience for Beauty and the Beast. This was pretty cool because basically what we did was we had to incorporate all the full res film assets. So we were working directly with MPC. Basically I had all of the film res quality assets, and then had about 15 animators spread all over the world, plus rigging, plus modeling, etc. And one of the big things we had to deal with was dealing with the film cheats. Anybody who comes from film knows that unlike game, you can cheat the living daylights out of everything because there's cuts, etc. So when you watch Beauty and the Beast in the film, there's lots of missing pieces to this. So not only did we have to ingest the film animation, but we also had to create all kinds of new animation to fill in the gaps. Then, on top of that, because in film you can cut, nothing has to line up. So we had to come up with a workflow where every shot seamlessly worked together, and all the animations were all the animators and animators were working on the same shot. And basically, that's kind of what I did. I basically came up with this paradigm for this particular sequence where everybody had, there was kind of a master shot everybody was referenced in, and it would turn on and off constraints based on which section of the shot you were working with, and then when you published, it would auto update the entire sequence so everybody had your latest stuff. So we could link all of this stuff together and everybody could work effectively on a single 1.5-minute long shot and still get it done in time. Most of the animators on that project were stoked because it's not that often that you get a chance to work on a Disney project from the comfort of your own home. So let's go back to the online pipeline stuff and the asset shot tree. As you would expect, this is where all the assets are stored. It's basically the directory structure. And and it's a lot about how we distributed the individual pieces to artists on various projects. So what are some of the goals and drivers when I was kind of setting this up and thinking about this? I needed to share the necessary files without sharing everything. There's a lot of reasons for this, but one great reason was bandwidth. Internet in early 2000s, mid 2000s was not as nice as it is now, as an example. We also needed to limit access so users couldn't get things they weren't supposed to, or to limit visibility. Now, a lot of this didn't have anything to do with necessarily our basically all of our contract workers. What it had to do with was largely Disney did not like the idea that their content could potentially be distributed, or a large portion of their content could potentially be exposed to more than it needed to be. So basically, some of this was also a security leaks thing. And we also needed a way to ensure that source assets were received without the overhead and artist burden of version control. And a huge part of that is just support and quality of life. So these were kind of some of the things that I was thinking about as I was building this out. As a quick little side note, this is actually a rig that we had rigged and did as a fur test for the Animation Mentor Animals and Creatures program, which was, that's kind of where this fuzzy cat came from. So talking about the shot tree a little bit more, basically it lived on a Linux box. It was a main source branch for all of the assets. There was a series of Python tools that managed the user's shots and sequences. For all of you ex-Sony people, I mean, I grew up Sony style, I was brainwashed. Sony style was a lot like the shot tree, only virtual. There was a little trick to it. Users had their own individual folders with a shadow hierarchy of the main shot tree that was shared with them. And what would happen was when a shot or an asset or task got assigned to an artist, then all of the tools would basically go through the database and the structure, figure out what assets specifically needed to be shared with those artists, and it would create symbolic links into their shadow hierarchies, thereby only sharing the stuff that they thought that they would be needed. So if they got assigned a shot and it referenced in a certain environment asset and 2 characters, they would basically get the published versions of that environment, and the characters into their shot tree. And so think about it like we were basically creating small windows into the whole shot tree through a series of symbolic links and things like that. For the shot tree, I wanted an auto-syncing solution to handle the asset propagation largely, once again, because for support reasons and just ease of use for artists. So at the time, simplicity was big. Google had a sharing thing, and Dropbox. I was evaluating basically everything under the sun that could handle this. Interestingly enough, I ended up going with Dropbox Business. There's a lot of really cool reasons for this. One, obviously the files automatically synced. 2, with Dropbox Business, I don't know if you've ever used it, but it actually maintains historical information on files. So without actually having to install version control, I was able to get historical information on files. And so if an artist called me and said, oh, I accidentally overwrote a version, or I lost it, or whatever, I could always go back into the history and grab that file without a problem. It was insanely cost effective. Most of the other solutions all charge you based on space. And as you know, when you're generating huge renders and stuff like that, space was huge. So Dropbox Business at the time was about $750 for a year. And then what would happen is you could leverage the individual users' Dropbox accounts. And what we would do is during production, we would just pay for, basically just pay for the upgrade to their individual accounts as long as they were working on a project with us. Some of the key learnings from this, we absolutely required file size consideration because, well, I'll get into the because in a minute, but as an example, this almost instantly required that we use Maya referencing. Back then, Maya referencing was not always in a happy place. So a lot of times there were different upgrade pipelines, but we had to do this because of bandwidth. Server location was huge. So initially it was on the West Coast, and then I quickly had to move it to Chicago there was a massive speed difference for the entire team in non-West regions once I did this. A huge part of why file size was important. As an example, if you're sending 500 gig ZBrush files through an auto-syncing tool to 30 people across the internet, it doesn't go well. Like not very well. And so during crunch, and there were a couple times this happened, with a render farm running 5 passes and churning out frames, when you're generating thousands of 50 meg EXR files, you can basically bring the system to its knees. And I almost missed a couple deliveries as a result of all of this. But it was cool. Overall though, it was pretty successful, and once a user was set up, literally they had the delivery mechanism, we got the Dropbox account set up, they literally spent all of their time in Maya. They never had to worry about checking files in and out or doing anything. Moving on. Production tracking. This is pretty straightforward. We basically went with Shotgun. This is largely because at the time there weren't a whole lot of other production tracking systems yet. And also by this point, I'd written so much and built so much, I did not want to take on building my own production management and tracking tool as well. To be clear, this did not include Tank. Toolkit wasn't even around yet, it didn't exist. But there were still some cool things that happened as a part of this, but obviously some of the goals for the production tracking was to be able to handle daily submissions, accessing the cuts for artists and for the client. And generally speaking, the studio would pay for Shotgun per artist during production, which also gave them access to Tweak RV for shot review, which is really important when you're doing dialogue shots and stuff like that. They also had an API that allowed dev so that basically the workflow was effectively when an artist submitted to dailies and review, you could do all of that from within Maya. So even though I didn't rewrite Shotgun, I did go through and do all the API dev work to set up for dailies, reviews, and submissions so that it was all there. So the artist would basically play blast locally or render through the farm. They'd review their frames, add any comments they had, and then they would submit that. And that would kick off a whole series of Python API scripts that would basically package the frames, submit them to Shotgun for dailies review. It would automatically update the cut to include the new submissions. And then this created an always current view of the cut that artists could review for when they weren't working on seamless VR projects, to be able to make sure that anything they were doing in their shots worked cross-cut. So, and then after dailies or whenever the director would review, basically the artist could review their notes in Maya or Shotgun. So inside Maya, there was a button they could click to just get their latest notes. So as they were working, they could see it. Again, this was all pre-Shotgun Toolkit and Tank. It didn't really exist yet. So, quick breath. Render farm. Again, with my awesome naming, I called it the Horde. I loved the Horde from Halo, the original Halo, and it just seemed like it applied. I guess that's where it came from. Same deal. I needed to eval a bunch of various render management software at the time because I couldn't also write a render manager. At the time, there was Deadline Q, RenderPal. Deadline and Cube ended up being far too expensive for kind of an indie setup, so I went with RenderPal. I think it was like, I want to say the license was around $2K at the time, and they also had an API as well. And this allowed me to build basically a cloud-based render farm. Okay, so why is there a sh here? In the early 2000s, licensing render management or licensing rendering servers, they didn't want anything in the cloud. Again, this is pre all this stuff. So they wouldn't give you a license to do renders in clouds. And so I had to work to figure out a way to make all this happen and work with Autodesk and stuff like that. But basically, one of the reasons why I wanted to go cloud-based was because in addition to everything else I was juggling, as much as I really, the computer geek side of me wants to own 1,000 machines in the closet of your house and be able to crank out all kinds of rendering, I didn't want to purchase it all. One, because it's expensive, and then there's the overhead of just keeping all those systems online and managed. I found the time I spent building a cloud-based render farm solution was far more effective. Artists could launch and monitor renders from within DCC, in this case Maya, for the most part. There were 3 primary components to it. We had the Overlord, which was the controller. We had minions, which were our workers, and then there was the NAS. Most of this will be pretty obvious to you guys. So talking about the Overlord node, this basically managed the queue. There was a balancing script. It was basically a balancing script. It was a Python-based watch script that would monitor the status of the render queue. And the fun part was it actually ran itself as a job in the queue. And what would happen is when a job showed up, it would spin up some number of slices based on the number of total frames for the queue. And then as the frames would finish, it would start kind of calculating remaining frame times plus other jobs that were in the queue. And it would spin up or spin down additional slices based on what it thought it needed. And then it would take slices offline upon completion. So quick art break. This was another project that I was working on. This is for Kong vs. Godzilla. This is another one where I was basically working with a crew to get Kong and Godzilla set up for a VR, basically a VR ride. This was all just about when COVID was starting. And these are the Unreal renders. These are Unreal turntables of where I got to with Kong. And again, this was the usual challenge of working with full assets. I mean, this mesh was over 1 million polys. I mean, it's bonkers. So getting that all down-resed, all the textures, everything, and then working in Unreal and trying to get some semblance of fur in Unreal that didn't look like just a naked monkey. So, but that was also a fun project. There's a couple other bits from here. This is Godzilla from that same project. Obviously, it's Kong vs. Godzilla. This was a turntable test. We went from, like I said, I think it was over 750,000 tries down to 100K tries for the high res. And then this particular turntable goes all the way down to 3K tries if we fast forward. But it holds up pretty well. And the whole gist of this was just to let the client kind of see what the options were from a resolution standpoint. And then I think we get down to, yeah, this is 3K tries now. And it holds up really well depending on how close you get and what time frames. And then, yeah, so that was that. Obviously there were a couple other characters, Mothra and Warbat and things like that. So back to the Horde. Minion, pretty straightforward. This is just the workhorse. Basically the minions were spun up. They did what they were told. They rendered a frame or not. And then there was the NAS. The NAS was basically the key to getting all this to work. Basically the Overlord and the workhorses, or the minions, they all basically mounted this drive as a common drive letter so that everybody was rendering to and able to access all of the shot information and paths and everything like that. One of the coolest things about this render farm was it came down to the cost savings at the end of the day. My cost per CPU hour was a quarter of the closest competition. So at the time, like Render Rocket and a couple of other people out there, I literally could crank out as many frames as I wanted for whatever short film I wanted to make at a quarter of the cost of what was going on. There was a fixed cost to keep the Overlord online, but it was worth it because setting up the Overlord was the hard part. So you just kept that online, and then over time, after a couple years of not using it, it was time to take it down, but you get the general gist. This is another project I worked on. I did all the rigging and asset de-resing and everything for Jurassic World, Fallen Kingdom, for the Dave & Buster's ride. Just a whole lot of dinosaurs. And then overall, what did I do with this entire... We're almost done, y'all. Thanks for staying awake. So what did I do with all this? This is my super scientific chart, sunshine and rainbows to doom and gloom meter. These are just some of the projects that I was lucky enough to work on during this entire time. Everything under sunshine and rainbows was pretty much awesome. And everything towards doom and gloom was shades of gray, darker. Some of those projects on the right, for various reasons, seriously made me question whether or not I should still be a character setup artist or not, if I had any clue about what I was doing or not. And then, as I mentioned, shades of gray. But There was some fun stuff in here. We helped David Jaffe, with his pitch for Drawn to Death after he finished God of War and Twisted Metal, and also worked on some of the rigs for that project. But that's kind of what that is. And with that kind of wraps up this whole thing. And so we can kind of do Q&A.
All right, so that wraps up the video. I did want to clarify, or at least thank a large group of people. Even though I mentioned a lot of this stuff, I was acting as a single dev and all that kind of thing. There's no way projects of these sizes don't come together without the help of a ton of people, either directly or indirectly. So all of the people who were literally amazing that I was able to help find and hire for various parts of this, whether it be when they helped support animation mentor students or the AM staff themselves or whatever, what inevitably would happen is these people were so amazing that they went on to crush their own careers. And so I was perpetually in this cycle of meeting amazing, high-powered, high-potential people who were just starting out their careers, who took time out of their days to help build this, basically. And so to all of those people, thank you. As well as every single animator we worked with, modeler, lighter, rigger, fur artist, all of them. I learned many lessons along the way, whether knowingly or not. You all taught me something throughout this process. So the current state of this pipeline is, I would call it mostly hibernation. I've scoped back a lot of what Animation Rigs was doing. We do still have a couple of clients who are working within the tool set and things like that, but for the most part, I've scaled it way back for basically family reasons, to try to focus on that. I am keeping it in that state though, because if I ever strike up my own company again or start working on my own film, all of the tools and everything will be there and ready to go. So that wraps up the Live in Freestyle. I accidentally built an indie pipeline. Thanks for taking the time to watch all of this, because I know this was long. Take it easy.